Welcome to Sinister Stories, where we dive deep into the chilling, spine-tingling mysteries that lurk in the darkest corners of the world. In this episode, we venture into the heart of the Angeles National Forest in Los Angeles, a place known for its towering trees, winding trails, and strange occurrences that even locals refuse to talk about. From eerie sounds echoing in the night to inexplicable disappearances, this forest is far more than just nature's beauty. It's a place where the line between the natural world and something darker, far more unsettling, blurs. Get ready for 3 disturbing true stories that will make you think twice before ever stepping foot in the wilderness around Los Angeles. These stories are real, chilling, and backed by the spine-chilling experiences of those who faced terror in the depths of this haunted forest. So turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for an eerie journey into the unknown. The Fire Road Stalker. It was a clear spring evening when Emily decided to take a break from her usual gym routine and go for a run on the fire roads that cut through the steep foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains just outside Los Angeles. The trail was well known among locals for its isolation and stunning views, though it had an unsettling reputation. Some runners claimed they'd felt watched by unseen eyes. Others spoke of odd sounds in the trees late at night, growls, whispers, footsteps that never seemed to belong to anyone around. Still, Emily loved running through the winding paths, feeling the exhaustion settle in her muscles as she pushed herself further each day. She brushed off the rumors, convinced they were just wild imaginings of paranoid people. That evening, she started her run around 6 p.m., after the sun had dipped low, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The forest on either side of the road was thick with underbrush, and the deepening shadows of the hills gave her the illusion of being alone in her own world. There was only the sound of her breath, the rhythm of her steps on the dirt, and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. But as she moved further into the trail, an uneasy feeling crept over her. Something was different. The usual background noise of rustling leaves and distant animal calls seemed to have fallen away. It was as though the forest had gone completely silent, as if it too were watching her. Her thoughts were interrupted when, up ahead, she saw a figure standing in the middle of the fire road. It wasn't unusual to come across other hikers, but this man seemed out of place. He stood tall, gaunt, his clothes mismatched and worn, his body appearing as though he hadn't showered or groomed in weeks. His eyes were cold, almost unnervingly calm, and he stared directly at her as she approached, not moving an inch. A sense of discomfort slid down her spine, but she quickly dismissed it. He's probably just another hiker, she told herself. As she neared him, she slowed down, expecting him to move aside. But instead, he whispered something just barely audible in the breeze, a sentence so low that Emily couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a plea, but it had an edge to it like a warning. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she tried to pass him, muttering a half-hearted, "Excuse me." To her surprise, the man didn't even acknowledge her words. As she tried to sidestep him, something compelled her to glance over her shoulder. There, still standing in the same spot, was the man, watching her as she continued down the path. She quickly picked up her pace, thinking that she must have misinterpreted his strange silence. But the faster she ran, the more she could hear something that was troublingly distinct, the sound of footsteps matching her own, but not in front of her or behind her, always on the sides of the road, as though someone was following her through the trees, pacing alongside her. Emily's pulse quickened, and her legs burned as she tried to push herself harder. She told herself it was just the way the terrain echoed, the quiet tricking her senses. She had heard of this phenomenon in the mountains, the way sounds echoed and distorted, mimicking footsteps even when there was no one near. But the thought did little to settle her anxiety. It was when she slowed down to catch her breath, her lungs filling with air, that she heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel and dirt underfoot, right behind her. Panic gripped her chest, and she dared a quick glance behind. There was no one in sight, but when she turned forward again, she saw him. The man was now standing in her path, staring straight at her. Emily's body froze. His expression hadn't changed. He seemed eerily calm, but his eyes glinted with something malevolent now. This wasn't just some harmless hiker lost in the woods. This was someone who wanted to harm her. "Don't run," he said softly, his voice like rustling leaves. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Without thinking, Emily spun around and bolted, her legs pushing her faster than she'd ever run before. The sudden burst of adrenaline sent her surging forward, but she was met with another horrifying sound. The man's footsteps were growing louder, closer now, in perfect sync with her own. She dared another look over her shoulder, but to her horror, he was no longer behind her. He was standing at the edge of the trail, his thin arms stretched wide in a grotesque, welcoming gesture. Frightened out of her mind, Emily ran blindly, her breath ragged and her chest burning. Her mind raced for an escape, any sign of civilization. But every time she looked ahead, the path seemed longer, the shadows darker, and the trees taller, as if the forest itself was shifting and closing in on her. When she finally reached the parking lot, a few miles down the road, still disoriented, the searchlights of her car illuminated the area. She leapt into her vehicle and locked the doors, her heartbeat still echoing in her chest. Her hands were trembling as she fumbled with her keys and drove away. The next day, she spoke with park rangers, hoping to brush off the experience, maybe find some logical explanation. As she described the man in detail, one of the rangers paused, his face growing pale. He told her the horrifying truth. The fire roads up there have a history of strange occurrences, and that area is known for hikers, people who wander off and never come back. His eyes grew narrow, as if contemplating his next words carefully. A few months ago, someone reported being followed in that same stretch by a man who appeared to have been there for years, not knowing how or why he was even there. Emily tried to dismiss the feeling that lingered in her gut. But that night, as she lay in bed, the memory of those piercing eyes still haunted her. And to this day, she's never run alone again, especially not on the fire roads. The Screaming Trees. It was meant to be a simple, relaxing camping trip. Sarah, Jack, and their friends had planned a weekend getaway in Angeles National Forest, a quiet escape from the busyness of their lives in Los Angeles. The idea of sitting around a fire, roasting marshmallows, and telling ghost stories around a cozy campsite felt like the perfect way to recharge. They chose a secluded spot near a trail that led to a clearing, deep within the dense forest. By late afternoon, the group had pitched their tents, set up a bonfire, and opened a few cold beers to enjoy under the slowly darkening sky. They had been there for hours, talking, laughing, and cooking food over the fire. But as night began to fall, a strange sense of unease settled over the group, something none of them could quite explain. The air grew heavier, cooler, and still. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, vanished. In its place was an oppressive silence, and a thick fog began to rise from the ground, enveloping the campsite. Jack was the first to notice the shift, but he thought it was just the usual ambience of the night. Just the fog, he shrugged, attempting to lighten the mood. But then Sarah's voice trembled from across the fire, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" The others stopped talking, suddenly aware that something was off. For a moment, they heard nothing at all. Not the usual sounds of the forest, nor the hum of insects. But then a high-pitched sound broke through the silence, a scream like a child in terrible pain. It was distant at first, echoing through the trees. The group froze, unsure if what they were hearing was real. But then the scream came again. Louder. Clearer. This time it seemed closer. Almost as if the forest itself was alive with the sound of desperate anguish. All of them jumped to their feet, straining their ears. They listened, and it came again, a shrill, agonized scream that sliced through the calm night air like a blade. The noise seemed to echo all around them, as though the very trees were resonating with the scream. It's coming from the trees," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse. "No," Sarah said, her voice quaking. "It's not the trees. But she couldn't finish her sentence. There was something in the sound, something unnatural and bone-chilling. It wasn't a human scream, it wasn't an animal's cry. It sounded almost like something calling from beyond, a sound out of place in the world of the living. Suddenly, without warning, the trees on the edges of their campsite seemed to shudder as though they were alive. The wind picked up, whistling harshly through the trunks of the pines, but no leaves rustled. It was as if the wind was trapped within the bark itself. "Get the lantern," Sarah urged, looking around. The darkness was heavy now, swallowing the light from their campfire. Someone stumbled over their gear, but the light seemed to get swallowed by the fog, unable to cut through the thickening mist. Then the trees began to move, not as if by the wind, but as though they were alive. The branches jerked and trembled, swaying unnaturally in unison. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the sound that had suddenly gripped the forest. The echoes, which had started off as a distant whisper, were now an omnipresent chorus of agonized screams that filled the very air. It seemed like the trees themselves were screaming. "We have to leave," Jack said, his voice strained with fear. The urgency in his voice made Sarah's blood run cold. Something inside her, something primal, was telling her to run. But just as they started packing, the trees seemed to reach for them. The air grew still again, the noise stopping as suddenly as it began. The unnatural stillness settled over the camp like a weight, suffocating them. Emily, another member of the group, screamed and pointed toward the forest's edge. Through the fog, she saw movement, a shape, a figure. Standing there, just beyond the tree line, a pale figure was watching them, its arms unnaturally long, its face devoid of features. The figure had no eyes, only a gaping mouth that stretched impossibly wide in a soundless scream. Then, a rustling sound came from all around them. The group looked at one another in horror as they realized what it was. The faces of the trees, asterisk asterisk, not bark, not leaves, but faces asterisk asterisk, shifting, writhing in agony. The branches twisted like limbs, as if the trees themselves were contorting in some grotesque, painful dance. "We need to get out now," Emily shouted, her voice cracking. With panic taking over their instincts, the group turned and ran. Their feet scrambled through the underbrush, hearts pounding, lungs burning as the fog thickened around them. The faces in the trees followed their every movement, twisting and turning with grotesque precision, and from the dark corners of the fog, distant whispers hissed warnings that made no sense. They ran until their breath became ragged and their legs gave out. Halfway down the trail, exhausted and terrified, they came across another group of campers who had set up their tents in the distance. They told their story to the strangers, but when one of the new campers mentioned hearing the screams of a child the night before, near the same clearing, they immediately packed up and left, too, just as nervous. The next morning, the rangers told them something disturbing. The area they had camped in had a history. 2 decades ago, an infamous cult had once used those trees for rituals, often sacrificing victims under the cover of night. It was said that their screams, both human and animal, could still be heard if one was brave enough to camp in that part of the forest. The cult's victims had never been found, and some locals still believed their souls were trapped in the forest, twisted into something horrific, unable to leave. "No one in their right mind camps here at night," the ranger had said gravely. Though they left without a word, the sound of those screams stayed with them, echoing every night they closed their eyes, like the forest itself was still alive, calling out to them, begging them to return. From that day on, none of them would venture into that part of the forest again. The memory of the screaming trees haunted their nightmares, and sometimes they wondered if the forest was still waiting, still screaming, hoping for more. The Vanishing Hiker. Eric was an experienced hiker who had spent years exploring California's vast wilderness. From Joshua Tree to Yosemite, he'd conquered difficult trails with confidence. So when he set out alone one brisk November morning to hike Devil's Backbone Trail in the Angeles National Forest, he thought it would be another routine adventure. Devil's Backbone had a reputation. Locals whispered about strange disappearances, eerie echoes, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. The trail itself was precarious, hugging the ridge with steep drops on either side. Still, Eric wasn't superstitious, nor was he easily spooked. He packed his usual gear, a GPS, flashlight, snacks, and a knife, and started his ascent. The first few hours were uneventful. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Eric noticed something odd. The trees on either side of the trail seemed closer together than he remembered. The path, once clear and marked, began to twist in unfamiliar directions. Eric stopped to check his GPS, but the screen displayed nothing but static. Frustrated, he pulled out his map and compass, but a creeping sense of unease settled over him. He felt watched, not by animals, but by something unseen, lurking just beyond his peripheral vision. As the daylight faded, strange sounds began to echo around him. At first, it was the soft crunching of leaves as though someone or something was walking nearby. Then came whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. Eric turned in circles, his flashlight cutting through the dense forest, but he saw no one. He tried to calm himself, muttering, "It's just the wind. Probably nothing." That's when he heard it. A laugh, light, innocent, and disturbingly close. It was the giggle of a child. His blood turned cold as he swept his flashlight across the trees, desperately searching for the source. His beam landed on a small figure standing a few yards away, a boy, no older than 7, with pale skin and wide, unblinking eyes. The boy wore old-fashioned clothes, a button-up shirt and suspenders caked in dirt. He stood motionless, staring at Eric, his head tilted slightly to the side. "Hey kid," Eric called out, his voice shaking. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The boy didn't respond. Instead, he slowly lifted a hand and pointed deeper into the forest. Eric felt a surge of dread. "I'm not going in there," he muttered, stepping back. The boy's expression didn't change. He stood still, his finger unwavering, as if willing Eric to follow. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, extinguishing Eric's flashlight. Panic surged through him as he fumbled to turn it back on. When the beam flickered back to life, the boy was gone. Eric's rational mind tried to take over. Asterisk, it's just your imagination. You're tired, asterisk, but his instincts screamed otherwise. He turned back the way he came, determined to retrace his steps. Every step felt heavier, the forest darker, the whispers louder. He no longer felt like he was alone. The whispers seemed to taunt him, growing clearer with every second. They weren't random sounds anymore, they were words. "Stay with us." Eric broke into a run, desperate to escape. Branches tore at his clothes, roots reached for his feet, but he pushed through, refusing to look back. Just as he thought he would collapse, he stumbled onto a clearing illuminated by flashlights. The search party was there. They had been looking for him for hours after he missed his check-in time. Disoriented and shaken, Eric tried to explain what happened. He told them about the boy, the whispers, and the strange, shifting trail. One of the rangers, an older man with a weathered face, looked grim. "You saw a boy, you said? Pale, about 7. Eric nodded, his hands trembling. The ranger sighed. "That's the florist kid. He went missing 20 years ago in this area. We never found him." Eric felt the world tilt as the realization hit him. He wasn't hallucinating. He had seen a ghost, or worse, something pretending to be a lost boy. To this day, Eric refuses to hike alone. He knows the forest isn't just filled with natural beauty. It hides something far darker. And late at night, when he closes his eyes, he still hears the whispers.